Aloha, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of Pacific Forum and our event sponsor, the Hindu American Foundation, I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, A New Era of U.S.-India Relations, Part 2, Competing Together. My name is Rob York, Director for Regional Affairs at the Pacific Forum, and your moderator for today's event. For those of you who are not familiar with us, Pacific Forum is a Honolulu-based foreign policy research institute. Through our original research initiatives, cross-cutting publications, public webinars, next-generation initiatives, and Track 2 policy dialogues, Pacific Forum seeks to promote a deeper understanding of the Indo-Pacific's geopolitical and security environment, and today's program is no exception. Competition with China looms over U.S.-India cooperation, presenting both dangers and opportunities. How should Delhi and Washington best coordinate to defend their interests? We'll be examining the answers to those questions and more in today's event. This is also the second webinar in a two-part series. For those of you who missed the event last week, a link to key findings from the first session is available in the chat box now. Before we jump into our discussion, allow me to share some housekeeping rules. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a audio recording of the session will be made available on the Pacific Forum website and social media in the future. The session will include feedback and Q&A with the audience. Participants' cameras are disabled throughout the session. However, during our Q&A discussion, participants will be allowed to unmute their mics to ask questions or give feedback. Note that participants may submit questions in the Q&A box as you have them during presentations. Finally, I would like to highlight Pacific Forum's recently published Comparative Connections chapter on U.S.-India relations. The article was made possible through the generous support of the Hindu American Foundation. With that, allow me to briefly introduce Mr. Samir Kalra from the Hindu American Foundation, who will provide opening remarks. Samir?
Great, thank you, Rob, and thank you to the Pacific Forum for putting on this second in this wonderful series on Indo-US relations. My name is Samir Kalra. I'm the Managing Director for Policy and Programs at the Hindu American Foundation. The Foundation is a national nonprofit advocacy and educational organization for the Hindu American community, which is estimated at approximately 4 million people. As the majority of Hindu Americans are from the Indian subcontinent or of Indian origin, educating policymakers on the ground realities in India and also promoting the importance of the US-India relationship is a key aspect of the work that we do at the Foundation. That's why we're honored and privileged to be partnering with the Pacific Forum on today's event, as well as a number of other US-India related initiatives. And the timing of this webinar couldn't come at a better time, as a partnership with India is once again in the spotlight with next week's official state visit to the US by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The fact that Mr. Modi will also be addressing a joint session of Congress and will be hosting a public event on the White House lawn that is expected to draw thousands of people is a further testament to the significance of India and the relationship with that country. We have a wonderful panel of experts who are going to be delving further into that relationship and provide their unique perspectives on some of the recent trends and developments, as well as where it goes from here, especially against the backdrop of growing competition and challenges from China. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it back to Rob to go ahead and get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. Now we will move on to our speakers. We'll have Mr. Akhil Ramesh of the Pacific Forum, Ms. Valina Chakarov of FACE for a Conscious Experience, and Mr. Elbridge Colby of the Marathon Initiative. Today's first speaker, it will be Mr. Akhil Ramesh. Akhil is Senior Resident Fellow at Pacific Forum and holds an MS with a concentration in Global Macroeconomics from New York University in New York, a certificate in Business and Geopolitics from Paris, France, and a BBA from Amity University in India. Born and raised in India, Akhil started his career in the Philippines and over the past 7 years has lived and worked across 3 continents, wearing different hats with risk consulting firms, think tanks, and governments. Most recently, he worked at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade on geo-economic issues in southern India. With that, Akhil, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rob, for the kind introduction. First and foremost, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and aloha to all. I believe we have participants from around the globe, so I wanted to cover my bases. So, and thank you so much for the Hindu American Foundation for making this happen. This wouldn't have been possible without your generous support. Thank you. So let me start off by talking about this webinar itself. So the first iteration, the second iteration of these two webinars is basically to talk about US-India relations and the comparative connections chapters that we authored last year. So last year we authored, actually I should say I authored 3 chapters on US-India relations, starting with the Cold War era differences and Indo-Pacific synergies, followed by relations at 75 Hawaii to Himalayas, and the last one between September to December, Friends with Benefits. So as you might notice with these titles, the relationship had its fair share of ups and downs. And this was not for any, I suppose, accident, but because of 2 major events. One was the India-China relationship that was, going down south. And the other one was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine, relationship in so many ways. And that's why the first chapter was on Cold War era differences and Indo-Pacific synergies. Because, in the previous iteration of this webinar, I talked about how hard it was to explain non-alignment, multi-alignment, and different concepts to a non-IR audience. And I got a test in the first 4 months of last year, trying to explain Russia's relationship with India, US-India relations, and China in the mix. So that was the first chapter. And the second chapter was basically relations at 75 years. India and the US celebrated 75 years of diplomatic relations. And I wanted to say how expansive the relationship is. And I wanted to sum it up in one line. So that was Hawaii to the Himalayas. Because we are in Hawaii and they just had a military exercise in the Himalayas. So when you have maritime exercises in Hawaii and the army exercises in the Himalayas, so it's definitely as expansive as Hawaii to the Himalayas. And there are no limitations in the partnership. And the third chapter, which actually got a lot of, interest from the title, was Friends with Benefits. So finding a title to sum up the relationship that is not an ally or a treaty ally or partner in which that it follows the US, I think to sum it up was Friends with Benefits. But there's a lot more to the relationship than just the titles. So we'll get into that in the next slide. So this was what I was talking about with regards to the shortage and skepticism. There was no shortage. So we often see, articles titled America's bad bet on India, on foreign policy, India is unreliable. It keeps on going. It's like a broken record. And this is particularly true for track 2. So at the track 1 level, what we call as government to government, I think the conversations have been much different. As Rob and Samir noted, the 2 leaders are meeting next week, and the NSAs just met yesterday, if I'm not wrong. Jake Sullivan met with his counterpart and with the entire intelligence ecosystem in India. So the track 1 is going fine, but the track 2 is a whole different show. And that's what we're looking at on this slide. And this is where I believe we need to, change the policy a bit. And next slide, please. So what is required? I would say we need to do 3 things. 1 is a considered approach to get past the Cold War era differences. And 2, change India as America's South Asian partner to India as its Indo-Pacific partner. And 3, expanding the general scope of the partnership. Next slide, please. So the first one is a considered approach to get past Cold War era differences. So this is the major challenge because, everyone, I think all nations have this muscle memory of the Cold War, and it's very hard to get past that. So to that, I think the major step would be to sort of not just economically decouple certain old partnerships, certain partnerships that have become vestiges or even legacy partnerships, but go on to be more forward-looking in the diplomatic initiatives. So that's what I would say as a considered approach to get past Cold War differences. And the second, the next slide, please, is the change in India as America's South Asia partner versus Indo-Pacific partner. So what I mean by this, so to start off, India was always seen as a South Asia country, meaning part of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka. So this was largely a product of the Cold War and also for what America was up to in Afghanistan. So its partner in Afghanistan was Pakistan, and its focus with regards to war on terror, made it laser focused on engaging its non-NATO treaty ally Pakistan over India. But that has changed. America is no longer in Afghanistan, and its priorities are vastly different. Theater is different, and it is no longer a South Asian country it needs to engage, but an Indo-Pacific country it needs to work with and be its partner of choice, if I may say. So I have a quick question to check the the participants or the audience's understanding of what I'm talking about. So next slide, please. So what we need is actually to start looking at the region differently, and that would mean looking at certain maps differently. So next slide. So we thought we'll make a game out of this. So if you can spot the difference between the three maps, the winner gets a special mention on social media. So we'll open up the chat box when we show the next slide, and please feel free to chime in on what you spot the difference is. So I suppose we can have another 10 seconds before we get it back to. I think the part I'm looking for in the answer is not just, I think most of, yes, okay. I think we got enough responses. I think we can close it out now for the. So what I was talking about was basically the center of the map. How we center the map, how we look at the world makes a huge difference, because each map has its own. Next slide, please. Next slide. So each positioning changes the way we look at things. And if you look at the map from the Indo-Pacific angle, from Pacific-centered map, the whole world looks different. Which country plays a bigger, larger role in the region is a whole different topic. So this is where I think India's role comes in, the Indo-Pacific partner. So India plays the role of securing the Indo-Pacific partnership from the shores of Mozambique to the Malacca Strait. So often there's a question in Washington, what is India giving us? We are giving India a lot of things. Even next week, there's talks of sharing jet engine technology to India, about selling drones to India. But what is India giving us? So India is basically protecting its own national interests, and I suppose by protecting its own national interests, it's creating a one sphere of influence, and that is from Mozambique to Malacca Strait. So India is the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific partner, the Indian Ocean partner. So India has been challenged by China in all the small red circles as shown on the map, whether it's in Maldives, Sri Lanka, in Djibouti in Africa, or in Pakistan, or in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, or whether it's a Chicken Neck in India's northeast, or in Arunachal Pradesh, India's northeast, or more recently on the Coco Islands off the coast of Myanmar. So there's no shortage of China, trying to poke the elephant. So with that being said, India has an added advantage or an incentive to protect its own shores and secure its own borders. So India will be the partner that secures the Indian Ocean part of the Indo-Pacific region. So that is the role. So the next time someone in Washington asks me the question, so I have an answer. And if there are any IR analysts and and the participants, you can use the same answer, because that is a big chunk of the work, securing the Indo-Pacific. Next slide, please. So expanding the scope of the partnership. What do I mean by that? By expanding the scope, I'm referring to the arenas in which they can work together. So India was once a license Raj. For ones who don't know what a license Raj is, it had a very socialist bent that you had to count on licenses and permissions, and there was a bureaucratic cholesterol, as some would say, back in the 80s, 70s, and up until the early 90s. So that has changed. There are still skeptics of India, but one sign of that is for sure changed is Apple moving its manufacturing to India. Solar companies moving manufacturing to India. So next slide, please. So in this slide, you talk about supply chains and economic security, and also as a bridge to the global south. So Apple recently, opened its first store in India, and it's not just a retail store, but they have expanded their manufacturing as well. And as the US envisions India, or positions India rather, as a supply chain alternative to China, I think India is going to be playing a much bigger role, not just in manufacturing or assembling phones, or maybe defense cooperation, arms production, semiconductors. The sky's the limit. So that is for supply chain diversification. The second approach the US could take is view India as the bridge to the global south. So one of the deficits, or rather the void that the US has, is with the global south. The G7 has not engaged the global south as much as, say, China has, for instance, through BRI, through vaccines, or I should say timely vaccines, and so on. So this is where India can come in. India has this goodwill in the global south, and it should be, I guess, opportune time now for the US to capitalize on that by being its partner in the global south. So next slide, please. So I don't know if you've watched Back to the Future. I'm a big fan of the Back to the Future movie series. So there's the scene from Back to the Future 3, where Marty McFly will be talking to the doctor about Japanese circuits. So he will ask him, no wonder the circuit failed. It says made in Japan. So just to give you a little background, doctor is from the 1950s. So they're talking in the 1980s. So a doctor from the 50s talks about, if it's made in Japan, it's not going to work. But Marty McFly is in the 80s, and he says, what do you mean, doc? All the best stuff is made in Japan. So that is the mindset change we are looking for. In 1971, US and India might have, come close to war, but it's no longer the case. We need the next generation, as I would say, the post-Soviet generation. I wouldn't identify as a millennial or a boomer or any of those sort, but I was born in the 90s. So I'm a post-Soviet baby. I grew up, looking for Kellogg cereal, McDonald's burgers, and Apple iPhones. So I think that is the generation mindset that needs to change. I think we, as the next gen, Marty McFly, should have the conversation with the doctor to talk about how things have changed. So lastly, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who participated. Thank you for my co-panelists, and for, of course, the Hindu American Foundation. I would like to close off by saying, this is a photo from our office in Hawaii. So this is the map we have in our conference room. So this is basically how we see the world. And I believe this is how more India analysts should see the world, see the US-India relationship going forward. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Akhil. Our next speaker, I'm delighted to say, is Ms. Velina Tchakarova. Velina, with over 20 years of experience, is a geopolitical expert with a strong professional background in security and defense policy. As a founder of her geopolitical consultancy, FACE, she leverages her vast network and practical experience to tailor solutions for public and private clients navigating geopolitical complexity. As the former director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, she has demonstrated profound expertise in analyzing the geopolitical landscape. Currently, she's involved with the Real World Risk Institute of Nassim Taleb, the Austrian Federal Ministry of Defense's Strategic and Security Policy Advisory Board, and the Defense Horizon Journal. Offering a comprehensive suite of services, Velina conducts research, consultancy, lectures, and publications on global trends, risks, and scenarios. She regularly engages in conferences and expert meetings, providing up-to-date insights on global system shifts and global system transformation. With that, Velina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure, and thank you to the organizers of this event, as well as to our distinguished moderator. Now, I will take on from the map, which actually positions not only the Indo-Pacific region, but also the centrality of the new global power competition. So we are already in a scenario of global, that means systemic a power competition between two systemic rivals, United States and China, in the Indo-Pacific region. And this, in my view, is going to be not only the Indo-Pacific decade, but probably even the Indo-Pacific century, given the fact that there are a lot of geoeconomic and geopolitical indicators pointing to the growing role not only of India, but also of the ASEAN region in terms of economic growth, in terms of regional power projection. And then, of course, what we have also seen from the map are obviously different regional formations that have been in the making. Now, I would like to use my time to draw your attention to India's key role. I would argue actually most important role and a unique one that no other relevant key player in the global affairs is currently having, namely as a bridge between the two bloc formations. Now, obviously, we do not like to talk about Cold War 2.0 scenario, even though that I belong to those experts who are actually convinced that we are already in this scenario and it is being manifested in the Indo-Pacific. But let's assume for a moment, for the sake of the intellectual exchange, we are in this Cold War 2.0 scenario, and that would mean not only systemic competition, but also, of course, it will mean a lot of hedging strategies and a lot of fluid ad hoc geopolitical and geoeconomic formations based on, of course, the interests of the one or the other key actor, namely United States and China. And here is where India has stepped in by practically getting involved in both worlds. On the one hand, having a very, very active role in the geoeconomic and the geopolitical formats led by the United States. This is the case with the quadrilateral format, which is by no means a security alliance, but at the very same time, of course, we have the AUKUS, which is a clear example of security and defense pact guided by the United States together with Australia and UK. And what we will be observing in the future is a growing role of Japan and India in this AUKUS. Of course, when it comes to Quad, we have a lot of geoeconomic realignment. We have reconfiguration of supply chains. We've heard about the example of Apple. From 25 million apples being produced in India as compared to the 240 million apples being produced in China, you see that there is a plenty of potential actually for India to catch up in this and in the next decade. Now, also, obviously, we have an alternative world, and that is the world that is very much being shaped by China. Here we have the Regional Economic Comprehensive Partnership. By the way, this was actually the alternative geoeconomic project when United States launched the TPP. Many years ago during Obama's administration. The TPP is long history, but the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is in place. And we have, of course, also the unique case that only India, except, of course, for the United States, is not part of it. But everyone else, I mean, including Western partners, and obviously the ASEAN countries are there. So you see already the animosity also growing simultaneously growing up when it comes to the geoeconomic power projection. But then again, we have the Shanghai Security Cooperation Organization, a very important regional organization for the Eurasian landmass, for the Central Asian countries and for the South Asian countries. A lot of new candidates to join the organization. And here we have this unique opportunity from India's perspective to become not just a member, but to shape the dialogue, even when the tensions, the military tensions between China and India happened along the line of actual control. And next to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, what we also have is the BRIC. Now, BRICS is currently gaining steam, but for us, for the geopolitical analysts, this is an organization with a long history. And right now, in this as I argue, Cold War 2.0 scenario in the Indo-Pacific, we see that China-led BRICS format is particularly being supported also by Russia and India as a counterweight to any unipolar alternatives. Now, here it is not actually, from an Indian point of view, it is not actually against United States per se, but it is actually against a possible alternative in which a sole state actor will shape the rules of the game in the future. And by actively engaging in these formats, obviously we see that this time it's not going to be about non-alignment, it's going to be more about multi-alignment, but in the end it is, as I argue, actually about Indian interests. So India, by participating in both Western and China-led regional formats in the Indo-Pacific, is actually betting on itself. Why is it the case? Well, first and foremost, India is being projected to become world's economic power number 3 in this decade. For that to happen, the government needs predictability and economic growth. And this can only happen, so political stability and predictability, but also economic growth. And for that to happen, of course, you need a regional context in which you have actually minimized any possibility of, let's say, ongoing military tensions. Now, we've seen, of course, a new episode of military tensions between China and India in 2022. But as we've seen also from the past, like the episode from 2017, both leaderships, the Indian and the Chinese, still could manage, I would argue, not without Russian help, to get along and to find at least somehow some avenues for dialogue. And I argue that exactly this kind of Chinese led formats are offering these avenues for dialogue, and specifically obviously this kind of tensions, as I also argue, are projected to grow in the future. Why? Because on the one hand, China will be in this competition modus with the United States. Second, it will be facing a lot of economic troubles. And obviously, this will result in a more, let's say, adversarial partnership and relationship in the particular region. As I pointed out, that India is in fact facing a quite of a positive scenario. What is the expectation for the future? Now, in this year, India is chairing the G20, very important format, and I argue actually much more important format than the G7. Because in my view, G7 has lost its geopolitical relevance because first and foremost, it doesn't reflect the interests of the global community. When actually the global South, that means the community of 6 billion, is not feeling represented. No matter what kind of decisions you are going to take, you are going to struggle to find, you know, a lot of states that will be actually compliant with your policies and with your strategy. So in a sense, we've heard that already from Akhil. Here, what would be the next block to kick off with concrete concrete suggestions? This will be the G20. And we've seen already actually from the summit of the foreign ministers of the G20 that India was facing troubles in getting all the G20 partners to sign a joint declaration. So this was the first signal, I think, for the Indian leadership to realize the limitations of this bridge building, let's say, bridge building function that the Indian leadership is currently playing between the two blocks. You can also call them, if you like, between the two, you know, different formation factors. But obviously, we talk about United States on the one hand and the dragon bear on the other hand, to China, Russia modus operandi. So given the fact that in this year there are more critical meetings, we have BRICS summit in South Africa, we have the very important G20 summit also in India. I argue that by facing these limitations and also by realizing that the coordination between China and Russia is in fact becoming slowly but surely detrimental to the Indian geopolitical interests, I argue that actually the Indian leadership will be more open towards the West-like formats. That will mean, of course, a more engaging role in the US India relationship. So I expect a lot in terms of messaging, by the way, during Modi's trip to the United States. We've seen already the first signals in this direction coming from the US administration in terms of organized events in Washington, but also in Delhi. I also argue that we still should be mindful of the fact that United States, as of now, actually needs India more in facing China in this long-term oriented competition, then India needs United States in facing the Chinese challenge in the regional domain. That means in the maritime domain, as we've seen on the map, and also along the line of actual control. So how to find the fine balancing act between the interests of United States and India. I think that this is something that Bridge is going to elaborate on. And final point, it will be actually a growing role coming from the Indian leadership within these formats, specifically those that are not guided by the West when it comes to advocating for the interests of the global South. So I actually suppose that India will take on a new role, which is not going to root only for its own national interests in that matter, but actually rooting for a third way, if you like, to avoid the emergence of a binary world in which all regional actors, including India, will be caught and will have to, at some point of time in the future, be faced with binary choices.
Thank you very much, Polina. And now, last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Elbridge Colby. Elbridge Colby is co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. He is the author of The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, published by Yale University Press in 2021, which the Wall Street Journal selected as one of the top 10 books of that year. Earlier in his career, Colby served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018. In that role, he served as the lead official in the development and rollout of the department's preeminent strategic planning guidance, the 2018 National Defense Strategy. And with that, Bridge, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Rob and Akhil, and great to be on with Valina and my friends at Pacific Forum. Really just a vital institution in informing and illuminating and advancing debate, discussion, understanding on U.S. and Pacific, sort of Asia Pacific or Indo Pacific security issues. So really a pleasure to be with my friends at PAC Forum always. I'll keep my remarks a little bit briefer so we have time for discussion. Look, I think the U.S.-India relationship is going to be vital, sort of whether we like it or not. We're sort of doomed to, if you will, collaborate. I don't mean that it's bad, but I mean that it's fated to be, I think, because as Valina touched on, I think there is, the fundamental structural thing happening in the world is geopolitical shifts, and while India has its own perspective on that, the most sort of immediate and pressing and structurally significant element is the rise of China. And so I think we fundamentally share a very tactile and concrete interest, which is preventing China from being able to exercise a dominant sway over areas that are genuinely critical to our interests. Obviously, in India's case, it's its own territorial integrity, line of actual control, as well as throughout South Asia, where China's already throwing its weight around quite a lot, and reasonable assessment can only be that it will continue to expand doing so. And for the United States, it's a little more indirect, but if you look at our history and our statements, the United States has long had a position where we are not prepared to allow one of the critical theaters of the world, especially not the most important theater, which is now Asia, again after half a millennium, to fall under the power of any hegemon, least of all one that is as aggressive and hostile in many ways as China is, fairly or not. We can litigate that separately, but I think this means I have a sort of different view. I actually quite sympathetic to the way that the Indian government, current Indian government, and particularly Foreign Minister Jaishankar talk about foreign policy and approaching foreign policy, which is more pragmatic, I would say, realistic, you could say, maybe a little bit instrumental, a very different tone and approach than you hear, at least rhetorically, from, say, Secretary of State Blinken or the president as a battle of democracy versus autocracy. Obviously, India is also democracy, and all kudos to it for that. Not that it needs to hear it from me, has its own reasons. That's sort of the point. I think the understanding I have, if you read Foreign Minister Jaishankar's book, I think it's called The India Way. He's criticizing the Delhi way, the old Delhi way, but is, look, let's be confident and practical and unabashed, but moderate and reasonable about pursuing our interests. And if you take things in that kind of almost like business-like way, then you look for people who are and states that are prepared to collaborate with you, where it makes sense, and there's not an expectation that you will be perfectly aligned. And I think that's exactly the right approach. And that Akhil pointed to some. I mean, many of, I'm sure we're all. I know we're all admirers, and many of us, I'm sure, are good friends of Ashley Tellis, who, in addition to being a dean of the U.S.-India relations, is a strategist in general of the highest order. But I think he was a little bit, it surprised me, a little bit glum about the future of U.S.-India relations. Obviously there are people who have concerns in India's domestic politics. I don't know, Indians may have concern about our politics. There are the sort of traditional non-proliferation people, trapped in amber from 25 years ago. And then there are probably the most pressing issue right now is the divergence over Russia. To me, those issues are ones that are secondary to the primary issue, which is China, which is overall, India has said it's their primary issue, and we've said repeatedly across two administrations, it's our primary issue. So when you're in that kind of, and of course, with the exception of Japan, there's no other country in Asia, actually the world, that remotely compares to the power and strength, and not to mention position, resolve that India brings to bear. So, when I look at some of these difficulties, I sort of look at or there's a misalignment on Russia. I don't stress out too much about it. The Russia situation is primarily going to be solved on the battlefield in Ukraine, and I hope they're as successful as they can be, and ultimately that there will be a settlement that's in Ukraine's favor. I genuinely do, but I don't think that's really material to our relationship with India in this, or you could say it's material, but it's distinctly behind our shared interest in confronting China with what I call an anti-hegemonic coalition, and doing so across the Indo-Pacific, and especially because the U.S. and the military position, because I think the military balance is really what's most central. Obviously, militaries are produced by economics, and economics is itself the goal. But the primary determinant of geopolitical dominance or not, or the balance of power, in where it actually nets out, is going to be military force. The United States is going to really must focus on the first island chain more than it has been. I mean, it's said it's going to do that, but it hasn't done that enough. And so we can't afford to be pulled away into places like the Middle East or what have you, or South Asia for that matter. And, but of course the Chinese have every reason to be active there. And so that leaves us, my view is kind of Nixon doctrine-like, without the sort of, mournful hint of retreat. It's more like a division of labor kind of model of countries that, India obviously is incentivized, resolute about issues in South Asia. It has a lot of capacity, has very little capacity or interest in intervening in a Taiwan context. I think ideally, the United States and India want to present China with a two-front problem in the way that the United States and China presented the Soviet Union with the two-front problem. That's just a tough issue. Obviously, when that gets down to nitty-gritty of military planning, et cetera, and the actual, responsibilities to get involved in a war that happens in the other theater, that's a tougher issue. But even just to tie down the attention and resources of the PLA and China writ large across two very different geographies and areas is going to be a big advantage, especially when you're dealing with a central power that has interior lines and so forth. So I think that's very important. And I think, I made an argument in a piece in the Hindustan Times after I was in India with Valina in January, arguing that the Taiwan contingency really is very immediately important to India. I was struck in Delhi that there was a sanguinity about both the potential for a Taiwan fight and basically probably how it would go. I don't think that was justified. Certainly doesn't reflect at least some views in the United States, I think, including in positions of influence and power or authority. If China defeats the United States in a conflict over Taiwan, it's likely to be a defeat of regional significance. And of course, China's already developing a military and basing our architecture to project power into the Indian Ocean area and South Asia. So, we do not want to be piecemeal, picked apart, divided and conquered, so to speak. Conquered is a little dramatic, but, put under hegemonic influence. And so I think this should really motivate our relationship going forward. My view is that the stronger we can make India realistically in the future, the better off we'll be. I think we should view issues in South Asia largely through the prism of India being the kind of lead there. Obviously, this would color the Pakistan relationship, where I think we should basically take India's side. And in places like Myanmar, look more to India's policy, to say, make sure that we're keeping open space, Nepal, Bhutan, et cetera. Bangladesh, rather than pursuing some of the pet agendas that have dominated during the unipolar era, and which frankly in this administration continue to have legs. I mean, in fairness, I think this administration has shifted a lot on great power competition and tried to do a lot, in some ways improving on what happened in the Trump administration. But I do think you still see a lot, particularly in areas like South Asia, of some of the kind of, out of date, and I mean, I often disagree with them on their merits, but leaving that aside, they're just out of date agendas that are sort of presumed on American unipolarity. I know India drives a hard bargain. I mean, I haven't participated myself in negotiations with Delhi, so it's hard for me to comment. I do think that we benefit from a stronger India. Obviously, we're not going to get our pockets picked, we the Americans. So, that's up for India, and I think it's fair for India not to, overestimate its bargaining leverage and, its ability to stand on its own completely without, U.S. partnership. I don't mean in a dependent way, but I mean, like, if we're out, if there's an outstretched hand, maybe it's propitious timing and opportunity to take it. You never know if that's always going to be there. Certainly, if I had anything to do with it, it would be. But I think that might be something for the Indian side to consider. And I say that more just because at the forum that Valina and I attended in earlier in the year, there was a sense from the American side that sometimes the Indian side is pretty drives a hard bargain. So that's negotiating, but something to consider. So. With that, I'll look forward to the discussion and question answer period.
Thank you very much, Bridge. We will now shift to the discussion and the Q&A portion of today's program. As a reminder to our audience, there are two ways you may submit your questions or feedback to our speakers. The first is to write your question using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your Zoom window. The second is to raise your virtual hand, also located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Once you have been called upon, Pacific Forum staff will enable your microphone. Please be ready to unmute yourself so you can verbally ask your question, and be sure to state your name and affiliation for the group, as well as who your question is directed to. Before we do that, I will start with a few questions as we wait for others to roll in. First of all, I would like to ask Akhil. We had one question submitted in advance from Pankaj Vora, who asked, can the US help India in building up its manufacturing infrastructure to shift supply lines from China to India? Then I have a question for Valina, which is, we often talk about India and its role, its bridge building role, as it is a member of BRICS, as it is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is its bridge building role hindered by its deteriorating relations with China? And finally, for bridge, do you see opportunities for collaboration militarily between the US and India, such as in, even if it's restricted to, say, exchange of defense technology or defense or intelligence sharing for that matter? Or is it primarily a matter of the two countries enjoying the other's ability to distract China? Okay, let's start with Akhil.
Thank you so much for the question. It's a very timely question because no one would have thought that, what was once the license Raj would become all of a sudden, a supply chain alternative. Even today, if you meet people in the business capitals of the world, there's still skepticism, but it is the political capitals of the world that share the optimism. So ever since the COVID-19, when national security policymaking and economic security policymaking intersected way more than usual, there's been an incentive on the part of security apparatus to push economic deals. I mean, if you look at even the semiconductor manufacturing initiative, it's the NSA is talking. In a usual day, normal day, it would have been chambers of commerce and the Commerce Department trying to push. So it's not just Captain Tai pushing for with Piyush Goyal pushing for more trade. It's actually Ajit Doval and Jake Sullivan talking about semiconductor manufacturing. So I think there's a lot of potential in particular sectors. For example, sectors such as semiconductors, solar panels, or even phone assembly, to more critical sectors such as advanced and critical technologies in the climate change sphere, for example, EVs and battery manufacturing. So these are the sectors where I believe the US sees China as a major threat. The Biden administration supply chain review highlighted these sectors as major risks. These sectors, maybe even pharmaceuticals, could be the major focus, because if not, the other sectors are more like in the Walmart sectors, as I would call it. You can't ship everything out of China. So the whole discussion on decoupling and diversification of supply chains is basically limited to certain sectors that are a threat to national security. So in those sectors, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and the US can support India both through its development agencies, but also by nudging its private sector to look at India and Vietnam to an extent as an alternative to China. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. All right, Galina.
Thank you very much. And I will just elaborate a little bit on this topic, because I, in fact, published an article in June 2020, making the case that we are going to witness one of the biggest global reconfigurations of supply chains, and one of the biggest winners of this reconfiguration of the supply chains is going to be India, of course, next to Japan, but also other trade centers in the world. And it's not just going to be the semiconductors, it's going to be the space, it's going to be the cyber, the defense, the AI, the quantum. It's about a plethora of critical domains amid a fourth industrial revolution, in which we have two clear competitors, and where the participation of key actors such as India is going to make a difference. I'm going to stop here. Now, when we consider India's role in the China-led formats, I argue that this is a smart realpolitik on behalf of India. Why? Because if you are not at the table, if it's about talks, if it's about negotiations, actually, as we like to say, you are on the menu. So someone else is actually talking about you and making decisions that will affect you directly or indirectly. So in a sense, being part of these formats is already a win from India's point of view. Also, we should not forget that this has been also the case during the Cold War, where there were direct channels of communication between United States and the Soviet Union, not only between the military, officials, but also on many other, occasions. And one of the cases was via regional organizations. So in that sense, I don't see actually the deterioration of the relationship between United States and China on the one hand, but also the deterioration of the relationship between India and China on the other hand, as an obstacle for New Delhi to take part in these formats. On the opposite, I think that there won't be a shift, at least in the short term, unless we witness a situation in which there is an unexpected escalation of relations of the relationship. But I would argue that right now both leaderships are actually, the leadership in Delhi and the leadership in Beijing are keeping it at a low profile, a low intensity. So in a sense, so long as this is the case, I argue that India will be still very, very, very active. Also, from India's point of view, here it is about the role of Russia. India won't give up on Russia. We need to understand that from the multi-layered perspective of the Indian national interest. It's not only about the UN Security Council when it comes to the position on Kashmir. It's not only about the arms sales, which are still at a level of more than 50%. It is not only about the role of Russia to create a credible counterweight to China when it comes to its role in Central Asia, when it also comes to the role of Russia in the Middle East, what is now being described as West Asia. So in a sense, another way of actually keeping itself updated, with both these two actors are doing, and projecting on others, is to remain part of BRICS, both BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And third, last point, and that is, of course, the G20 agenda. Now, if India is actually planning, and this will be my case too, even if it is not successful with, let's say, a joint declaration at the summit, but the takeaway from India's point of view will be how to create a continuum in terms of, like I said, this, very specific role of being an advocate for 6 billion people. And here, once again, given the fact that both formats, the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, are now going to welcome more members, we are going to see more members from the Global South. So it is a very, very good also way of how to create a kind of a counterweight, diplomatic, if you like, or in terms of positions, to future coordination of Russia, China. So also from that perspective, I think we are going to see more activity on behalf of India.
Very good, thank you. And Bridge?
Great. Well, just maybe to briefly comment on some of the things that Velina raised in her very good comments. I mean, I think my read on Indian foreign policy on things like, Russia, but also the G20, other fora is, and I, kind of read through the lens, not only just kind of abstracted, but also the rhetoric of and sort of logic that I hear from people like Jaishankar, is that they regard these as opportunities for shaping and gaining leverage in a tough world, in a tough neighborhood. They're not relying on others. So, it's not surprising to me that India is still participating, I think, in SCO operations, because with the Russians, part of the reason that Velina, I think, rightly assesses the Indians are not going to back away is because they don't want, they've got China right in their face. They also got Pakistan, et cetera, state collapse in Bangladesh, you mention it, Maoists in Nepal. They're not going to allow a situation in which they believe, as I understand it, that Russia is totally in China's camp, including in things that matter for India, or, they're facing 2 nuclear powers directly on their border. And of course, my impression of the Indians, I emphasize the China point, but it's not that they need to see China in exactly the same way as we do, or behave like us on every policy, or like Japan does, or whatever. I mean, look, my impression of the Indians is that they have no illusions about China, or that China will say. I mean, when we were there in Delhi earlier in the year, I was doing a couple of other meetings and so forth, and presentations, and the kind of vibe I got was, I would talk about China, and they'd say, "Don't lecture us about China. You're the ones who created this problem through 25 years of WTO entry and PNTR and so forth." And it's like, we're not the ones who need to be worried. They were actually, I got a number of questions asking if we were going to go back to G2, which, well, I mean, looking at what's happening right now, those questions were less crazy than I maybe thought at the time, although I don't think we will go back to G2. I mean, I don't know if you saw Qin Gang's response to Blinken, basically saying, you solve all of the problems that you have caused, and then maybe we'll have a substantive discussion. So, the only people who appear to believe in the thaw are somewhere in the Biden administration, but I think so. I mean, their impression of the Chinese. I mean, they've had bloody hand-to-hand fighting, lethal fighting in the Himalaya, or wherever it exactly the line of actual control is. So, but they see it more. I mean, their border, unlike the situation with Taiwan. I mean, the Indians are not going to, or the Chinese are not going to pour down from the Himalayas into, the Indus River Valley or what have you, or the Ganges or something. It's more salami slicing, more, kind of what you often hear in the West about South China Sea kind of approach, say in Bhutan, but also a real sense of, how powerful the Chinese are. And I that's something that we would be better off taking more seriously in the United States. I think the Indians have a healthy fear would be kind of the wrong, I don't want to suggest that they're cowering, but sort of a healthy respect, maybe you could say, for the strength of the Chinese, and they're not to be trifled with, especially when China can cause so many problems, backing Pakistan. So that's sort of how and if you look at what they're doing in Myanmar and keeping open channels there, that's clearly, and rationally designed to avoid Myanmar, to the potentially falling completely into China's orbit. So, et cetera, and the engagement in the global South, presumably is at least in somewhat about ensuring that, large swaths of Africa, South Asia, Latin America don't go completely over, into the Chinese orbit to the extent that that's possible. So that's how I sort of read. And to me, that actually makes quite a lot of sense. I wish our foreign policy were a little bit like that, and less about hectoring people about the rules-based international order. But that's just kind of my assessment of Indian foreign policy. On the particular question that was posed to me, it's a very good one. And I'm out of the Pentagon for a while, so I'm operating at a altitude, not a distance that is so great that I can't give a really informed, granular answer. But what I will say is my basic idea is that we should be taking respective sort of responsibility for the theaters that we are most concerned about, and not relying too much on each other. And of course, the fact that India wants to be self-reliant, to me, is a feature, not a bug. It's great. Last thing we need is another, security ward, as so many of our allies are. We need countries like India that may have independent foreign policy, okay, but they carry their own weight, and in fact, they insist on carrying their own weight. That's the sort of thing that we need now. Are there ways that we could improve our mutual position, or I don't want to say joint, but improve each other's position by having higher degrees of coordination? I have no doubt, and I know Samir Lalwani wrote a piece the other day, kind of arguing for some, and I think Samir is very in tune with a lot of these issues, and I think it was Vikram Singh. They both are very attuned to these issues. So I'm sure, and I think Ashley Tellis has also pointed to this. Are there ways that we could do more intelligence sharing? I know there was stuff in 2020 on the border, but I'm sure there could more could be done. And as the extent of a scenario of a regional conflict, God forbid, in the Western Pacific, as we go farther out, China's power projection capabilities become greater. There's likely to be more of an impact, not only directly along the Indian border, but also in the Indian Ocean. So my sense is, and Samir has written about this before, these are things that are on the table. So I would encourage both sides, certainly, our side, but also the Indian side, to see what we can do, but consistent with the idea that, look, like, we're not trying to, think the US and the British on one side and the Soviet Union on the other in World War II, not trying, each side is kind of responsible for that part, but if there are ways to help each other, the Murmansk Line or Lend-Lease, or specific, I believe the Soviets launched an operation around the time, before D-Day, to assist the Western landing, these kinds of things. I mean, God forbid that we got in that kind of a cataclysmic conflict, but just thinking ahead to try to deter that outcome, it would be good if we could do that.
All right. Well, I have you, Bridge. I have a question here from Brant Mabuni, who is our resident Honda Fellow. If not the central barrier in growing the U.S.-India relationship up to this point has been the U.S.'s Cold War-era support for Pakistan over India. With Islamabad's political instability threatening the possibility of ceding more influence to China or generating general chaotic spillover in the region, what does India want from the U.S. at this point? What would it need from the U.S. regarding Pakistan in order to grow the larger strategic relationship?
I mean, I made an argument along these lines back in, I don't know, 2018, maybe. I mean, in the Wall Street Journal, saying, this was during one of the last flare-ups with Pakistan, where I think the F-16s were going over or whatever, but which was take India's side. Like, I think we should be on India's side. Being on India's side does not prohibit our ability to have a relationship with Pakistan. The model I used, I think, in the piece was, we're on Israel's side, but that doesn't prevent us from being able to have influence and be able to potentially broker at least some ways with the Palestinians or other Arab players. But I think the fundamental thing here is that we should dispense with the idea that we're on Pakistan's side as we were in the Cold War, but also that we're somehow like a neutral arbiter. Like, no. Like, we're on India's side because of the primacy of the overall relationship. I mean, basically what's happened, in my view, is we've had a flip of there's a natural flipping of our relationships and partnerships in the region, because the primary problem has flipped. In the old days, it was the Soviet Union. So we ended up being partners with China later in the Cold War, with Cambodia, with Pakistan. Thailand's kind of a special case, a little bit of a ambiguous case. And now it's flipped. China's the problem. So the countries that naturally align with China, Pakistan's primarily worried about India, looks to China. Cambodia is primarily worried about Vietnam, looks to China. So we flip. We're with Vietnam, India, and so forth. So I think that we should not. I mean, look, we should. And my impression is that our relationship with Pakistan is pretty thin at this point, anyway. But I don't think we should in any way allow there to be a perception that we're somehow like, equivocating or equilibrating, that, we're on India's side, but we can, maintain I mean, the Indians may want us to maintain a relationship with Pakistan anyway. But with a clear sense of where our, which side we're sort of on.
All right. This next question will be for Akhil, and it comes from Mayuri Madi. How does the rise of the Hindutva movement in Indian internal politics affect America's relations with India? And I would add to that, how common do you think your perspective as the post-Soviet baby is in India? It is, of course, a diverse place, but what is your sense?
Thank you for the question, and I will take Rob's part first head on. So all you have to look at is the pending visa appointments to the US, the long lines in Delhi, Hyderabad, Chennai, to know that, where they want to go. Was it Friedman, if I'm not wrong, who said that you can judge by their feet? So, it is moving in one direction. So that's the answer to your question. So there are more post-Soviet babies than, pre-Soviet ideas of let's, go back to socialism, or let's work with, socialist countries or things like that. So to the answer to the other question, I would actually give an example of a Kenyan official. So when the US delegation was in Kenya, the Kenyan official said, every time we have a US or a British official, we get a lecture. But when China's here, we get a hospital. So that is the approach that U.S. or the Western countries have been using for a long time in post-colonial societies, and that's why they've been losing out in the global South. I think it's kind of rubs the wrong way in a post-colonial society if you talk about their internal affairs. It reeks of neocolonialism. It's like very condescending to tell another country how to run the country, how to run your nation. So it generally doesn't go the right way. So with regards to India's case, I think it's similar. Whether whether it's the Congress in power or the BJP is in power, whether it is any other party in power, I'm not certain that the Indian government would like U.S. intervention in its domestic affairs. I mean, it is the order of the day. It depends on if you're in a unipolar world or if you've woken up and moved on to the multipolar world. Because in the multipolar world, we have a situation where Saudi Arabia and China have a joint declaration saying we appreciate the partnership because there's no involvement in internal affairs. They're basically taking a jab at certain countries. If you want to talk about each country's internal affairs, then you won't have any partners in a multipolar world. So that is the issue. And also the problem with the US approach to talking internal affairs has always been that it's a different standard for different countries. You want to talk about Bangladesh's democracy, but you won't talk about Pakistan's democracy. You won't invite Bangladesh to the democracy summit, but you'll invite Pakistan. So Blinken recently was talking about sanctions on Bangladesh with regards to its elections. That's a disaster. If they go through with that, that'll be a disaster. And already have sanctions in Myanmar. And that has basically made Myanmar into a satellite state. If there are no Burmese in the call, I'm sorry, but Myanmar is now a satellite state of China and Russia. They depend on the Chinese and Russian defense. So you want to push them further. You want to push Bangladesh into China's arms and make India's security a huge problem. So I would say if you want to engage the global South, you need to start by quitting the policy of getting involved in internal affairs of other countries. I know it's anathema to Washington, D.C. Like Bridge was talking about the liberal international order. You have to lose that. Realism should be the book that needs to sell. Machiavelli, you need to start reading more realists and more liberal internationalists. It's 2023. We're not in 1970. Sorry. Thank you.
Can I just jump in on that? Because I totally agree with you, Akhil, on the importance of adopting a more realistic foreign policy. And Machiavelli was a little, rich, or not rich, but that's the strong stuff. There are more moral realists out there. But anyway, I agree with your point. But I also think it shows. I mean, candidly, I think I'll say something that I imagine many Indians infer. But it's like the farther that Washington's much more likely to throw these sanctions on these political issues on like Bangladesh and Myanmar or Thailand, which reflects how important these are perceived to be in Washington. It's like high dudgeon in a lot of ways. It's not something where, they're going to overlook it because it's like, well, there's a strategic interest that's more compelling. And it's like, well, if China's the problem and India is a vital partner, shouldn't we be looking at the strategic perspective? Not to say that we don't care about democracy, but also, giving China control. I mean, I know Francis Fukuyama, for whom I've always had great respect, although he's kind of gone into like the almost the caricature of himself in the last year or so. I mean, I don't think we're at the end of history in the sort of easy sense of like democracy is going to be dominant everywhere forever. If China is dominant in the world, I mean, why did the third wave of democratization really happen? Well, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union, obviously, right? I mean, that was the main driving factor. You take out this huge power instead of money and influence and military force in most places in Eastern Europe and so forth, and well beyond in Latin America, it collapsed. So the most important, it's almost overdetermined. It should be just on state interest grounds. But even if you care about democracy, pushing countries like Myanmar and Bangladesh closer into the Chinese orbit, especially when we, the Americans, have quite limited leverage over these countries anyway, I would expect, certain places like Thailand, and the Chinese have a lot to offer, to your point about hospitals. That's just really, it doesn't make sense, but it's very deeply embedded in Washington's DNA right now. It's going to have to change. I think, I don't know if some of you saw, I was arguing on Twitter with somebody who, whether realism is possible. I think during the Cold War, we actually pursued a policy that was often rhetorically very liberal, kind of high-minded, but in practice was more sometimes quite tough or even ruthless, and certainly in the places like Central America over the generations. But more would be like, I would say, realistic. I mean, we did not intervene in Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968. I mean, it's a tragedy, but we were not crazy. And we did not go looking. We did not start war. Korea, unfortunately, Vietnam were primarily, and I would say Vietnam was partially motivated by an over ideologization of the Cold War. But basically, the point I'm making is, if we got back to that standard, I think we could do a lot better.
I would like to jump on here. I mean, let's be real. During the Cold War, the two strategic pillars of United States in the Gulf were Iran and Saudi Arabia, two perfect examples of democracies. I very much agree with Akhil. It's not going to be about democracies. So it's not going to be even about realism. It's going to be about a pure realpolitik as of 19th century and concept of power until a new power equilibrium has established itself. Right now, we are in this really chaotic interministic period of the international relations. We don't know, so the system is reestablishing itself. We don't know whether we will really end up with a multipolarity as most of the states wish it to be, or whether we will end up with the Pax Americana 2.0, or whether we will end up, as I argue, with a bifurcated world in which both blocks, that means the United States on the one hand and China, Russia on the other hand, will agree that the systemic coexistence is the most, is the optimal option, because every other option will be too disastrous, in terms of ruin scenarios. That would mean, of course, also increasing the risk of the use of nuclear weapons. And looking from that perspective, I mean, looking from all these three scenarios, Pax Americana 2.0 or multipolarity or Cold War 2.0, India has placed all the eggs in the right geopolitical, baskets. So in a sense, the case here is that navigating through these complex waters, through these muggy waters of regional formations and blocks and alliances. There was also a question about, for instance, the AUKUS initiative and what would be and India's role in Quad. So here you need to understand that if we are to face a world in which it's going to be once again about norms, about the normative, setting, it's not going to be about democracies versus authoritarian governance, because some authoritarian regimes will actually side with the West, not because of the way how they are governed, but actually because of the international rules of the game, in which actually businesses and investors and states are operating. And this is here the concept about free and open Indo-Pacific, which is centered around the Japanese idea. And of course, India is also part of it. So when we talk about Quad, this is really not a security and defense alliance, but it's really a concept, conceptualizing the future relations between the Indo-Pacific countries as opposite to what China is trying to impose. And that is, an international and regional order with Chinese characteristics. Now, there was an example given about how, China, when China steps in, you see a hospital, you see a highway, but at what price? Because I absolutely agree with Akhil. 20 years rule in Afghanistan, and what has United States left in terms of infrastructure. And right now we are actually debating why China is going to step into the mining sector and is going to build infrastructure to connect Pakistan, to connect Iran, and so on and so forth. So we should not blame others for having visions how to actually impose their understanding on the state relations, but also on the relations between organizations. We should be more visionary and more, courageous in terms of how we want actually to establish certain rules of the game. But so long as this competition is ongoing, and it is ongoing, like I said, in all various domains, we are actually not be able to set the new games. To set the new rules of the game. So in a sense, this is also a competition about norms. This is also an ideological competition, if you like. We have all of it in this context. So here, I think in the short term, it may be beneficial to play the equidistance card in terms of realpolitik calculus for the Indian elite. But in the longer term, having going a third way, and being an own center of power in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond is going to take much more, much more leadership, much more power projection, much more, let's say, unpleasant decisions, in terms of power projection.
While I have you, Velina, Malton has put this in the chat. Let's assume for the sake of argument that India and the US were not partners. India would still have to balance against China. India has no choice. So if the US were not partners with India, it would get the benefit of India balancing against China. Would you like to respond to that?
Yes, very shortly. Like I said at the beginning of my introduction, United States needs India more while facing the Chinese challenges, then India needs United States in facing actually the regional challenges coming from China. So India has been already prepared for these challenges and has actually the military footprint. So contrary to the European Union and the European powers, which don't have a skin in the game, because they even were not able to prevent a war from happening. And even when the war occurred, if it were not for the United States, in fact, Ukraine will have lost the war at the beginning, in the first stage of the war. India is a very different geopolitical player. So it is a geopolitical player that is able and willing to use military force against China. Probably one of the few players at all that are actually able. So in that case, they don't need United States. Where they may need United States in the future, and this is what I was implying with my example about the equidistant strategy in short term, as opposed to the long-term challenges that will demand a more strategic, more smarter Indian positioning. And this is the defense partnership with the United States if India decides to diversify away from Russia, out of strategic necessity, of course. Having a dependence beyond 54% on a single supplier is suicidal in this transitionary period of international relations. So one way how actually India is going to diversify away, because they will need, they will need the arms supply in order to be prepared for future military tensions with China, is actually via partnerships with the United States, but not only. And in that matter, of course, I see more, let's say, a stronger convergence of interests between India and United States. And like I already pointed out, all the other key domains that will be critical for India's future positioning as a regional center of power on its own. Thank you very much.
Right. So another question for Bridge. Do you see the US and UK sharing serious assets such as Five Eyes intel with India? That's where the relationship gets teeth. This question comes from Karen Datta.
Well, I think Five Eyes, no. I mean, Five Eyes is not, I mean, close US allies like Japan and South Korea and France are not in the Five Eyes. So that's kind of a very high standard. I mean, if it were up to, I mean, look, the US, a lot of this is, I would say, I mean, there are real issues, but I think the US, and I've thought this for some time, needs to adopt a really much more lenient approach towards transfer or sale of technology to friendly countries, and look at the difficulty that track 2 of AUKUS is having. So that's India is not alone in this. I don't know all the issues offhand, but I think we need to change our fundamental approach. That sort of the presumption is on not doing things, and I mean the congressional ability to intervene in arms sales. We're seeing it right now in Europe. Leaving aside the merits, it's just very difficult. And the Pentagon apparently studied this problem, and it's going to train more people to work in the FMS process. But I don't think it's fundamentally like a narrow process problem. I think it's a structural issue of where we're putting the burden. And and I mean probably the Indians are driving a hard bargain and so forth, as I hear. So it's not easy. But I think I think the flip side of India wanting to maintain all that autonomy, which I respect and admire and support and so forth, is that there's going to be more hesitancy about sharing certain things. And of course, the very point that Valina was making about a diversification of defense or military sources, and the ultimate desire to indigenize a lot of the defense production, which makes total sense, is obviously something that Americans are going to say, well, I mean, am I just going to give away the IP and all that? So, look, I think this is going to be a matter of negotiation between partners, and probably in areas where we feel there's more bang for the buck in terms of providing India with capabilities. Maybe we'll be willing to take more risk or lean farther forward. But I don't think like the Five Eyes thing is, and not to pick on that, but just like the Five Eyes thing is really the right standard. I mean, we're going to have a much different kind of relationship, and of course, India's it's going to be one of the world's 3 largest economies in the future, and it's going to have enormous indigenous capabilities, and so it's presumably going to not match the U.S. across the board, at least for the foreseeable future, but I think it'll be more of a relationship between equals, which is going to be a different experience for the Americans, but also probably for India. So we're going to have to just navigate this. I did want to, if I understood Valina correctly, I think she said that America needs India more than India needs America on China. I don't think that's true. I don't know who needs the other more. I will just say if America is pushed out of Asia, India can't stand up to China alone. It will be contained, and it will be put in a very, very difficult position, especially because countries in ASEAN and East Asia are going to accommodate China. So India, I think, definitely does need America. And of course, Europe's not going to be there to bail India out if America gets pushed out. So I think there's a deep mutual interest in working together to check China's hegemonic aspirations.
Mm-hmm. All right. I believe I will give the last word to Akhil. There are 2 questions here. One is, how do Indians view the Quad? What is their perspective on it? And then there's another question, which is, for deeper relations between the US and India, what possibilities do you see for the development of the cultural relationship, particularly higher education?
Okay, thank you so much. To start off with, I'll clarify one thing. I mentioned Machiavelli as an example. I'm more like a Mearsheimer person, but then if I say that, we will lose all the Ukraine audience. So just to be safe. But to the point on the Quad, and also even to take off from what Bridge was talking about, the Five Eyes, and also his response to Valina's need question. I think it's 2 things. One, the relationship shouldn't have a discussion on whether who needs who more. If it's a partnership of equals, then there shouldn't be this possessiveness or jealousy between the 2. It's like a couple thing. You can't argue who needs who more. It should be an equal partnership. I would extend that to the Quad as well. So India sees the Quad as, I suppose, an extension of its deterrence measure. By doing it individually, it can also do it in a multilateral setting through the Quad. But the Quad also has more of a public goods side of it, more than a hard security element, even though it's changing. So that is the biggest difference. And if the Quad were to have any teeth, I would say that the defense deals that they're discussing are going to be discussing next week in DC, are going to be finalizing in DC next week, will be quite important, because US has to essentially share certain technologies, sell certain arms and like drones, for instance, for India to say take care of its own maritime security. I think that'll play a big role in how strong of a partner it is in the Quad, and whether it sees the Quad as a grouping to deter China. I mean, it'll never go out of its way to say that publicly. It's just not India's style. I mean, what is that old Roosevelt saying? Big stick ideology, the speak softly and carry a big stick, if I'm not wrong. So India wants to have that big stick. India wants to have the GE jet engine. India wants to have the drones. India wants to have its nuclear capabilities. India wants the S-400 from Russia, all for its biggest security threat right now, China. And speak softly, because you don't want to antagonize China, or you don't want to use different multilateral platforms to I guess make it if you don't mind me saying, a pissing contest. You don't want to go to Papua New Guinea and talk about China. You rather talk about what's the issue that affects them the most. I think that is another mistake, if you don't mind me saying, the Americans in the room, is that you go to Pacific Islands and talk about China's influence instead of saying what PNG or other Pacific Islands need. I think that is the approach India takes. So they'll extend that to the Quad as well. With regards to the cultural exchanges, I think that'll be the biggest pillar. If you haven't seen it already, this entire webinar series was supported by a diaspora organization. I mean, that says it all. I mean, that's the strength of the relationship. It's one pillar, I would say. In the US-India partnership, if economy, defense are two pillars, I think the diaspora has a big pillar. So cultural exchanges will be key. And it'll also play a big role in the whole discussion on interference in domestic affairs as well. So the culture plays a big part in India, how the US, I suppose, reviews or portrays the culture in India will play a big role in how Indians view the US as well. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Akhil. Thank you, Bridge and Belina. I want to thank each of our speakers for their great presentations and taking time to share their insights with us. I also want to thank all of you who submitted your questions and contributed to this enlightening discussion. We apologize that we could not get to all of them. We would also appreciate if you could take a few minutes following the event to fill out a post-event survey. Please see the link shared in the chat box now. And once again, I must emphasize our gratitude to our sponsors at the Hindu American Foundation for their support for this webinar series. We're proud to do our part. Thanks once again, all of you who have joined us, and please stay tuned to additional programming that Pacific Forum will be offering. Please stay well and stay safe.